Good morning. This is my second lecture. Today, I want to really introduce the concept of European expansion into the Americas, and then we'll talk about the English New World, and maybe we will even begin to talk about Jamestown, Virginia. I'd like to begin this morning by introducing the idea of models of interpretation. In other words, historians over a long period of time have told quite different stories about the European and African encounter with America. They have offered very different stories about what this all meant. I want to introduce you to what I'm going to call three different models of interpretation. These are our models for understanding European expansion and the transformation of the Americas that resulted. The first model of interpretation that I want to discuss is what I'm going to call the conquest model. Incidentally, when I send you the link for this lecture, I will also be sending you a lecture outline, which will identify the major themes and topics along with major vocabulary. So this will be the first instance in which I send you a lecture outline, but sending out such an outline will become a regular feature of how I do these pre-recorded lectures. So the so-called conquest model. This is a very traditional story about European expansion into the Americas. It is a deeply flawed one. At least its flaws have become too apparent to us in 2020. This is a model, the conquest model, which is based on the premise, on the idea of European superiority. It is a narrative that focuses on the story of heroic adventurers, missionaries, and soldiers who share Western civilization with indigenous peoples, and in doing so, open a virgin continent to economic development. Again, it rests on the premise of European superiority. Therefore, it is arrogant, it is racist, it is ethnocentric, and it is offensive. It depicts both indigenous peoples in America and Africans as inferior and largely as victims. The person of Christopher Columbus has figured largely in this conquest model. When I was a kid, growing up in Western New York, we used to celebrate October the 12th as Columbus Day. And we got a day off from school. There was a parade in the city of Buffalo. And Columbus was hailed as a hero. Columbus's historical reputation has changed considerably. Today, Columbus is viewed as an agent of genocide, of Holocaust, of mass murder. And the changing historical reputation Christopher Columbus underlines how this conquest model has become outdated. The second model of interpretation, which I want to discuss, is the Holocaust model. The word Holocaust, of course, has deep emotional meaning for most of us. The word itself references the effort of the Nazis during World War II, their murder, mass murder of millions of Jews in other European peoples. Uh, this Holocaust was an effort at genocide. The fact that one historian has used the term Holocaust to describe uh, the impact of European expansion to America is very telling indeed. And we know that millions of lives are going to be lost following European expansion into the Americas. One historical demographer, someone who studies populations and what happens to populations over time, um, John Thornton has argued that in the first 100 years following Columbus's stepping ashore on the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean, 60 million indigenous people lost their lives. That is an enormous human tragedy. But was it a Holocaust? What was the cause of this mass death? It, of course, was disease. Columbus and the Europeans who followed him brought microbes on their breath and in their bloodstream, which ravaged the populations of indigenous peoples who had no immunity to diseases like smallpox and influenza. And pandemics resulted. We know a little bit about pandemics right now, don't we, as a consequence of the ravages of the coronavirus. But most of the death that resulted, the loss of at least 60 million lives in the first 100 years following the beginnings of European expansion, can be attributed to disease. So the question then becomes, was this a Holocaust? Clearly, the Nazi Holocaust, that horrible effort at genocide, was purposeful. It was designed. Was the loss of indigenous life as a consequence of the introduction of these diseases? Was this purposeful? Was this by design? Was this an early example of biological warfare? It's hard to argue that. It's hard to argue that. Frankly, Europeans did not know enough about medicine and the spread of infectious diseases to have planned this. So, without a purpose, without a deliberate decision to do this, does this rise to the level of genocide? Can you have genocide without clear purpose and plan? If it was not intentional, was it in fact a Holocaust? Some would argue that it was. The United Nations in the past has defined genocide in the language of genocide takes place whenever one people put another people in circumstances that result in mass loss of life and destruction of culture. So in accordance with this definition, the United Nations definition of genocide, then what happened to indigenous peoples could be characterized as genocide. The principal advantage or benefit of the Holocaust model, I think, is that it forces us to come to terms with the enormous human tragedy that resulted from European expansion. And we haven't even begun to talk about the institution of slavery yet. We will be talking a good deal about slavery throughout this course, and we'll begin to talk about slavery next time when I examine the matter of the subject of race and the beginnings of slavery in Virginia. I think the principal weakness of the Holocaust model is that it tends to represent both indigenous people and Africans only as victims. Yes, they were victims, but they were much more than that. They were central players in the story of the development of many new American societies that followed the encounter between Europe and America. The third model that I want to talk about is the encounters model. The encounters model. This is a narrative that highlights the fact that the story of America is really the story of how three distinct peoples, Europeans, Africans, and indigenous people, Native Americans, how three distinct groups of people, each possessing their own unique culture and worldview, how they met and interacted, and how through a process of creative adaptations, they created many new American societies. I think it's probably already clear to you that the encounters model is the one that is favored by the great majority of historians at this point in time, because it does recognize the importance of Africans and indigenous peoples, peoples who were pretty much left out in any meaningful way, left out of the conquest model. And while they figure largely in the Holocaust model, it's only as victims. They have no agency, as social historians might say. The encounters model is an interesting one. It is the general model, the general narrative that I'm going to use throughout the rest of this course. And let me share with you an anecdote, which I hope will serve to highlight the value of the encounters model. Let me share with you perhaps a minor event in the early history of 17th century Maryland. Apparently, in or around the year 1636, an Englishman named Captain William Claiborne was operating a trading post on the Maryland frontier, a store, a place that did a lot of business with local indigenous peoples. Well, apparently one day, a group of indigenous people representing the Wacomis tribe, I will include this word in the lecture outline for today, A group of Wacomis Native Americans. They were young men, probably teenagers, and as teenagers, they had not yet achieved the status of being warriors. They came into Claiborne's trading post, and there's no record of exactly what business they may have had in mind. But while they were in the store, another group of indigenous people came in. A group from the Susquehannock tribe. Now, the Susquehannocks were adult men. They were warriors. And when they took notice of the Wacomis teenagers who were already in the store, they apparently made fun of them, ridiculed their manhood. The Wacomis were intimidated. They were shamed, and they left the store. They left pretty quickly, but their anger did not subside. Instead, they waited in ambush. And when the Susquehannocks left the trading post, they were killed. They were attacked and killed. In the aftermath of this event, the English governor was outraged, and he demanded that the Wacomis teenagers be turned over to English justice. For their part, the Wacomis understood that something bad had happened, but they were surprised at the English demand that the Wacomis offenders be made subject to English justice. The Wacomis leader essentially said that the English were guests on Indian land, and that therefore it should be Native American standards of justice rather than English ones, which should prevail in this matter. What the Wacomis leader had in mind was there were two general ways of dealing with murder among indigenous people. One had to do with a tradition known as raising the dead. This is not the story of Jesus raising his friend Lazarus from the dead. Rather, raising the dead for indigenous people meant that the family of the perpetrator would offer a slave to the family of the murdered victim, and the slave would literally substitute for the family member who had been killed. There was another indigenous tradition known as to cover the dead, and this had to do with the family of the perpetrator paying restitution, offering gifts and payments to compensate for the loss of the murdered person. Whatever you might think of these indigenous customs or indigenous ways of dealing with murder, they were real enough, and they were part of the indigenous peoples of America, part of their legal and social system. So I hope that from this anecdote, you can see that the encounters model emphasizes trying to understand historical events, major ones, even minor ones, perhaps like this, to understand historical events from the perspective of the different peoples and different cultures who were involved. Let me mention one other important idea that has become central to this so-called encounters model. And it is the idea of a Columbian exchange. And this so-called Columbian exchange tells the story of the exchange of peoples, animals, plants, even diseases. The exchange that takes place as a consequence of European expansion and the encounter of Europeans with indigenous peoples. Just to give you a couple of examples, and we talk about the exchange of plants that begins with European expansion. Europeans are going to be introduced to new foods, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, foods which even today are an important part of the American diet. Europeans are going to take sugarcane to the Americas with respect to animals. The Europeans bring domestic livestock with them. They bring hogs and cattle and chickens and goats and horses. Domestic livestock were not native to the Americas. The impact of so many free roaming European livestock on the American ecosystem is going to be substantial. But this idea of a Columbian exchange, you should see, fits very nicely into this so-called encounters model, which emphasizes the give and take between not only Europeans and indigenous people, but the give and take between Europeans, indigenous people, and Africans who are introduced into the Americas as slaves. Let me turn to the beginnings of English expansion into the Americas. The English are Johnny-come-latelys, the Spanish in particular, but the French as well, are going to come to America before the English. The story of English colonization of the Americas begins with the interesting person of King Henry VIII. As some of you probably know, Henry VIII is mainly remembered for his 6 wives, for his gargantuan sexual appetite. The man was a glutton. When he died, he weighed almost 400 pounds. But his historical significance is real. He is one of the early English kings who is going to play a vital role in the political consolidation of England. He also has a pivotal role in bringing the Protestant Reformation to England. Henry's first wife was a Spanish woman named Catherine, and after 20 years of marriage, Henry wanted a divorce. She had failed to give him a son, a male heir to the throne. He appealed to the Pope, Pope Clement VII. The Pope said no. Actually, Catherine, Henry's wife, was a relative of the Pope. Probably had something to do with the Pope saying no. But Henry did not take no for an answer. And he repudiated the Pope, he repudiated the Roman Catholic Church, and he brings the Protestant Reformation to England. He establishes the Church of England, and he placed himself at the head of this new church. Then Henry moved to confiscate Roman Catholic Church lands in England, which were quite extensive, upwards of 25% of all English lands. And Henry begins to sell these lands. he needed revenue for the political consolidation of England that he had undertaken. The buying and selling of these church lands is going to have very real economic consequences. It's going to start a major real estate boom. It's also going to lead to an early textile revolution, which has very real economic consequences for late 16th century England. Henry's repudiation of the Roman Catholic Church and his bringing the Protestant Reformation to England had four major consequences. And I want to briefly touch upon because all of them are relevant to understanding the beginnings of English colonization in America. The first consequence of Henry's break with Rome was the birth of Elizabeth I. This was Henry's daughter, and she ascended the throne in 1558. She would have a very long reign until 1603. She is regarded as one of the greatest monarchs in English history. One historian has argued that under her reign, England triumphed on land, at sea, and in the human spirit. And it was during her reign that important steps would be taken. Important steps that finally lead to the settlement of Jamestown in 1607. The second consequence of Henry's break with the Roman Catholic Church, it ushered in about 100 years of intermittent warfare, on again, off again warfare between England and Spain. England carries on its war against Spain largely through so-called sea dogs or English privateers. These were captains and their crews that, with the blessing of Queen Elizabeth, attacked and seized Spanish ships. For the most part, Spanish ships that were sailing from America back to Spain. These Spanish ships were often carrying gold and silver, which had been stolen from indigenous peoples. In the course of the warfare that the sea dogs or privateers carried on against the Spanish, they learned a lot about the Americas, about the New World, and this information would be valuable when English finally take steps to begin their colonization of the Americas. The third consequence of Henry's break with Rome was the encouragement that it gave to English religious reformers, men and women who took the Protestant Reformation a lot more seriously than Henry VIII did. These reformers, these religious reformers, would take the name of Puritans. And it was one group of English Puritans who would go to America and establish the important colony of Massachusetts Bay, which we will begin to talk about on Friday. The fourth consequence of Henry's break with Rome had to do with the economic changes that would grow out of Henry's confiscation of church lands, the beginnings of a textile revolution. Lots of English land will be transferred from growing crops to raising livestock. This major economic change had the effect of pushing a lot of English men and women off the land. English men and women lost their jobs, and it gave rise to a perception that England had too many people, had too many men, women, and children. There was simply no longer enough land or jobs to sustain everyone. And this sense that England had a surplus population would become, over time, a rationalization for English colonization in the Americas. If England had too many people, perhaps some of these surplus English men and women could be transplanted in America, and America would become a place where new Englands would be established. So one other consequence, economic consequence of the changes that grew out of Henry's break with Rome, the buying and selling of land made some English merchants and businessmen quite wealthy. And this wealth, this private wealth, would subsidize English colonization. One of the principal differences that separates English colonization from Spanish colonization was that English colonization was largely directed and paid for by private wealth, where Spanish colonization was directed and subsidized by the Spanish government. When the English begin to think about America, their initial thinking was very much shaped by the fact that remember when Columbus set sail across the Atlantic in the fall of 1492. What was he doing? Was he looking for America? No, he was looking for a new Western route to China. And he believed that rather than sailing around the east coast of Africa and finally turning eastward for the Orient, that he might sail west and reach Asia in China that way. Columbus greatly underestimated the distance from Europe to Asia via a Western route, and of course, excuse me, Columbus did not know about the existence of America. When Columbus bumped into America on his journey to Asia, the fact that America was an obstacle in the way of getting to China. This way of viewing America as an obstacle would influence European thinking for a long time, and it influenced English thinking about America throughout the latter part of the 16th century, the 1500s. As the English became more interested in America, they continued to think about it as an obstacle. They continued to think about America as a place where naval bases might be established from which English privateers could launch their attacks against Spanish ships. But finally, toward the end of the 16th century, some Englishmen started to think about America as a place where surplus English population might be transplanted. And this is going to, this latter thinking, is going to lead to an effort to establish a colony at Roanoke. The island of Roanoke off the coast of what is today North Carolina. In 1685, a naval base, a military outpost, was established by the English on the island of Roanoke. Didn't last very long. But in 1587, a couple of years later, an Englishman named John White decided to establish a settlement there. And he would lead a group of English men, women, and children to the island of Roanoke. John White even took his daughter, who was pregnant at the time. John White's an interesting individual. He was not an adventurer. He was not a privateer. Uh, he was an artist. In fact, when he got to Roanoke in 1587, he used his skills as an artist to do some watercolors. And White's watercolors of Roanoke represent perhaps the earliest English visualization of America and what America potentially had to offer. John White returned to England in 1587. He left the party of men, women, and children that he had led there behind. He ostensibly he went back to England to recruit more potential settlers, to perhaps get some financial backing, and he planned to return within a year. It would be 3 years before he would return. What prevented him from getting back earlier was the attack of the Great Spanish Armada against England in 1588. Remember, we just mentioned the warfare between England and Spain that was going on throughout the latter decades of the 16th century. Anyway, when John White finally returned to Roanoke in 1590, he found the settlement, the location of the settlement that had been established 3 years before. There were still buildings, but he does not find a single living person. The men, women, and children that he had led there had all disappeared. He doesn't find any bodies, but perhaps you wouldn't expect that he would. Some 3 years after since he had left, Roanoke is still remembered as the fabled lost colony, and we still do not know what happened to this first real serious English effort at establishing a permanent colony in North America. Speculation about what happened. Maybe angry indigenous people attacked and killed the English settlers. Maybe life became so difficult that the English perhaps ran away and they joined various groups of local indigenous people. We still don't really know. There's no definitive answer to what happened to the people at the colony of Roanoke. With the failure at Roanoke, Elizabeth dies in 1603, and notwithstanding all of the important steps that had been taken to lay the groundwork for English colonization, in 1603, when Elizabeth died, England still did not have a permanent colony in North America. That would be left to Jamestown. Jamestown is going to be established just 4 years later in 1607, and we will turn to the story of Jamestown tomorrow. See you next time.